Amina Williams walked briskly through the narrow streets of the city, her gym bag slung over one shoulder, her gaze focused and her mind sharp. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the buildings, and the sounds of distant traffic mixed with the faint hum of voices from nearby cafes and shops. Amina was no stranger to these streets. She'd grown up around here, in a neighborhood that had seen its share of hard times. But it was hers, a place that shaped her, made her strong, and taught her resilience. Now, after years of hard work, she'd become a respected figure in her community, an accomplished martial artist, a youth mentor, and an advocate for equality and social justice. Today, she had spent hours at the local community center, training a group of young women in self-defense. She poured her heart into these sessions, teaching them how to protect themselves, not just physically but mentally and emotionally. Amina believed in empowering others. She knew that sometimes the world didn't offer protection freely, and you had to take control of your own safety. This belief had been instilled in her by her mother, a fierce woman who had fought for civil rights back in the day, passing down to Amina a legacy of courage and strength. As she walked, her thoughts drifted to the faces of the young women she'd trained today. Some were already tough, hardened by life's challenges, while others had that initial hesitance, the uncertainty of whether they could truly defend themselves if the need arose. Amina recognized that look because she had worn it herself once, a long time ago. Growing up, she'd faced her share of discrimination and bias, times when the world had tried to make her feel small. But each time, she'd fought back, learning to channel her frustration into strength, her pain into power. Now she stood as a symbol of resilience, a woman who had not only learned to survive but to thrive, and she wanted to pass that on to the next generation. Lost in thought, Amina rounded the corner onto a quieter, more narrow street, lined with old brick buildings and small businesses. She enjoyed these solitary moments when she could just breathe, reflect, and feel the pulse of the city beneath her feet. But her sense of calm was soon interrupted by a figure coming toward her, a man whose expression seemed clouded with irritation and impatience. She didn't know him, but something in his stance, in the way he moved, caught her attention. He was tall, white, and middle-aged, with a hardened look on his face that spoke of years of bitterness or anger. His shoulders were squared, his jaw clenched, and his eyes held a flicker of something hostile. Amina could sense his energy even before he reached her, an almost palpable tension radiating from him. She had encountered men like him before, those who carried around their prejudices like a weight they refused to let go of. Men who looked at her and saw only the color of her skin, or the fact that she walked with confidence, as if it were a personal affront to them. She had learned to brush off such encounters over the years, to not let them burrow under her skin. But today there was something different about this man. She could feel his gaze as it swept over her, assessing, judging. Just as they passed each other, he deliberately brushed his shoulder against hers, hard enough to make her stumble. Amina stopped in her tracks, regaining her balance before turning slowly to face him. She kept her expression calm, her eyes steady, but inside she felt a flicker of irritation. She could ignore him, pretend it was an accident and keep walking, but something told her he had done it on purpose, a petty display of power. As she turned, he was already glaring at her, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of disdain and smug satisfaction. "Watch where you're going!" he spat, his voice laced with a derision that hung heavily in the air. His accent was sharp, clipped, as if each word were designed to cut. Amina met his gaze unflinching. She was used to confrontations, to people trying to test her limits, but there was an added layer of venom in his words that she couldn't ignore. "Excuse me," she replied, her voice calm but firm. She didn't raise her voice, didn't meet aggression with aggression, but there was a strength in her tone that made him pause, if only for a moment. But his hesitation was brief, replaced quickly by a sneer. "You heard me," he said, crossing his arms over his chest. "You people think you can just walk around wherever you want, like you own the place. This isn't your neighborhood, you know. Maybe you should remember that." Amina's jaw tightened, but she kept her face composed. She could feel the familiar weight of frustration settle over her, the urge to snap back at him, to tell him exactly where he could shove his assumptions. But she took a breath, reminding herself of who she was and what she stood for. She'd been through worse than this. A random man on the street wasn't going to break her composure. "I have as much right to be here as you do," she said steadily. Her voice was calm, measured, and she made a point of standing her ground, not backing away. "So why don't you go on with your day and leave me alone?" But instead of walking away, he took a step closer, his face twisting with anger. His eyes bore into hers, filled with a dark, simmering resentment that was almost palpable. He was looking for a fight, that much was clear. She could see it in the way he held himself, in the tension that radiated from him like a storm waiting to break. "Oh, you think you're tough, don't you?" he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Think you're so strong, walking around here like you own the place. You know, women like you need to learn their place. You're nothing special." Amina felt a spark of anger flare up inside her, hot and sharp. She was tired of men like him, tired of their small-minded hatred and their need to belittle anyone who didn't fit into their narrow worldview. She had fought too hard to let a stranger make her feel small. Squaring her shoulders, she took a step closer to him, matching his intensity with a silent, unyielding strength. "You don't know anything about me," she said, her voice low but steady, "and I don't need to prove anything to you." He glared at her, his face flushed with anger. For a moment, he seemed at a loss, like he didn't expect her to stand up to him. But then, almost as if on impulse, he lashed out, his hands snapping up in a quick, brutal motion. The slap echoed through the street, a sharp, shocking sound that broke the stillness. Amina staggered back, more from surprise than pain. Her cheek stung, but it was the sheer audacity of the act that left her momentarily speechless. She blinked, feeling a surge of emotions, shock, anger, and a fierce, burning resolve. She straightened, looking him dead in the eye. The initial shock on his face faded, replaced by a smug, satisfied smile, as if he'd proven something. But Amina wasn't done, far from it. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and in that moment, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was about to regret ever crossing her path. Amina stood still, her cheek still stinging from the slap. The world around her seemed to pause for a brief, surreal moment, as if the air had thickened, trapping her in a bubble of disbelief and outrage. She stared at Trevor, who stood there with a twisted smirk on his face, his eyes glinting with a sadistic satisfaction. To him, this was a victory, a moment where he felt powerful, as if he'd put her in her place. His stance, his sneer, every inch of him screamed triumph. But he didn't know her. He had no idea who he'd just challenged. Amina could feel her heartbeat slow, each beat resonating through her body with a steady, grounding force. She was a fighter, both by nature and by training. Years of martial arts, years of honing her body and mind had prepared her for moments exactly like this. She didn't need to be reckless or act on impulse. She'd been taught to control her reactions, to channel her strength with precision, and she knew, instinctively, that there was only one way to deal with a man like Trevor. She took a slow, steady breath, her gaze never leaving his. In that breath, she made a decision. This wouldn't be a moment she would walk away from. Too often, men like Trevor acted with impunity, assuming that women, especially black women, would simply accept abuse and retreat. But Amina wasn't just anyone. She wouldn't allow him to feel emboldened by his actions. "Is that all you've got?" she said quietly, her voice low but carrying an edge that sliced through the silence between them. Trevor's smirk wavered, his confidence faltering for just a moment. He hadn't expected her to respond like this. He'd expected her to cower, to leave. But Amina was rooted, unwavering, her eyes locked onto his with a determination that made him hesitate. "What did you say?" he snapped, his voice sharper now, his face flushed with irritation. He wasn't used to defiance, especially not from someone he saw as inferior. To him, Amina was just another face in a world he thought he could control, just another woman he could belittle and intimidate without consequence. Amina took a step closer, erasing the small space between them. She wasn't intimidated, and she made sure he knew it. "I said, is that all you've got?" Her tone was controlled, laced with a calm confidence that unsettled him. She wanted him to understand that his petty act of violence didn't shake her. If anything, it only solidified her resolve to stand her ground. Trevor's face twisted with anger. He clenched his fists, his fingers trembling slightly. The look in his eyes shifted from smug satisfaction to barely contained fury. He took a half step back, momentarily thrown off by her resilience. But the realization that his attempt to dominate her had failed only fueled his rage further. "You think you're some kind of tough girl?" he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "Think you can just walk around here acting like you own the place?" He took a menacing step forward, as if trying to reclaim the control he'd lost. But Amina held her position, unflinching, her face calm and composed. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she replied, her voice firm. There was a fire in her eyes now, a controlled intensity that made Trevor's skin prickle. She wasn't yelling, wasn't threatening him, but something in her calmness was more intimidating than any raised voice or clenched fist. He could feel the power in her gaze, a power that went beyond physical strength. Trevor scoffed, trying to shake off the unease that was settling over him. He was used to being the one in control, the one who others feared. But this woman, she was something different, something he couldn't quite understand, and that scared him more than he'd admit. "Maybe you should watch your tone," he sneered, his voice straining to sound confident. "I don't think you understand who you're talking to." He wanted to reassert his dominance, to remind her of her supposed place. But his words rang hollow, and Amina could sense his fear, buried beneath the bravado. "Funny," she said, tilting her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "I was just thinking the same thing about you." The tension between them grew, thickening the air like an invisible weight pressing down. Amina's calm defiance had thrown him completely off balance, and for the first time, Trevor felt genuinely threatened. He wasn't used to this, to someone looking him in the eye without fear. He took another step back, his expression flickering with uncertainty. But then, as if he were grasping at the last remnants of his pride, he clenched his fists, preparing to strike again. But Amina was ready. Her body moved almost instinctively, her stance shifting as she prepared to block his advance. She had no intention of letting him lay another hand on her. As he lunged forward, she sidestepped, catching his wrist and twisting it just enough to bring him to his knees. She used his own momentum against him, a move she'd practiced countless times, her grip firm but controlled. Trevor gasped, pain shooting through his arm as he struggled against her hold. The shock on his face was evident. He hadn't expected her to be so strong, so skilled. In his mind, she was just a woman, someone who should have backed down long ago. But here he was, kneeling in front of her, utterly at her mercy. "Get off me!" he snarled, trying to wrench his arm free. But Amina's grip didn't falter. She could feel his desperation, his need to reclaim the power he thought he'd lost. But she wasn't giving it back to him. Not now. Not ever. "Is this how you handle your problems?" she asked, her voice calm and almost gentle, as if she were speaking to a child. "By trying to intimidate people who won't bend to your will?" Her words cut deeper than any physical blow could have. She knew that the real battle here wasn't just about strength. It was about breaking down his sense of entitlement, his belief that he could bully his way through life. Trevor glared at her, his face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. He wanted to lash out, to hurt her, to prove that he was in control. But her grip on his wrist was unyielding, her gaze steady and unbreakable. She was like a wall he couldn't scale, an obstacle he couldn't overcome, and the realization filled him with a helpless rage. "People like you!" he spat, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. "You think you're so special, so untouchable. But you're just what?" Amina interrupted, her tone cutting through his words like a blade. "Just a woman? Just black? Is that it?" She leaned in slightly, her gaze never wavering. "Or are you just afraid that I'm not afraid of you?" Her words hung in the air, a challenge that pierced through his anger, stripping away his defenses. For a moment, Trevor was silent, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for a response. But there was nothing he could say, nothing that could reclaim the control he'd lost. In that moment, Amina released his wrist, letting him stumble back onto the ground. He clutched his arm, his face twisted in pain and disbelief. He looked up at her, his expression a mixture of hatred and helplessness, as if he couldn't understand how things had gone so wrong. Amina didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any words, a final act of defiance that left him feeling small, defeated. She had stood her ground, unshaken, and in doing so, she had exposed the fragility of his pride, his power. Trevor struggled to his feet, clutching his bruised wrist, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. He wanted to say something, to hurl one last insult, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was glare at her, his mind spinning with a mixture of anger and shame. As Amina watched him retreat, she felt a surge of pride, a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing she had not only defended herself, but had also shown him, and anyone else who might have been watching, that she was not to be underestimated. And as he disappeared down the street, she knew this was only the beginning. Trevor might be out of sight, but his actions had consequences, consequences that would catch up with him soon enough. Amina watched as Trevor retreated, clutching his bruised wrist and casting furious glances over his shoulder. His face was flushed with a mixture of rage, humiliation, and disbelief. He had clearly expected her to shrink back, to submit, but instead, he'd been brought to his knees, literally and figuratively. Yet Amina sensed that this wasn't over. Men like him didn't simply walk away from humiliation. They festered, stewed, and sought revenge. And sure enough, as Trevor disappeared around the corner, Amina caught a glimpse of him reaching into his pocket for his phone. She could tell from his posture, the rigid set of his shoulders, that he wasn't calling for an apology or to let the matter rest. No, he was calling for backup. The realization settled heavily in her stomach, but she refused to let fear take hold. She'd stood her ground once, and she would do it again, no matter the consequences. Taking a steadying breath, Amina looked around, assessing her surroundings. The narrow street was quiet, with only a few distant figures moving about, most of them too far away to notice the altercation. It was a gritty, neglected area, a part of town where people tended to keep their heads down and mind their own business. She knew she couldn't rely on bystanders stepping in to help, not here. If Trevor brought back reinforcements, she would be on her own. In her mind, Amina ran through her options. She could try to leave now, to slip away before he returned with whoever he intended to summon. But something within her resisted the idea. She hadn't spent years training, strengthening herself both physically and mentally, to flee at the first sign of trouble. And besides, if she ran, Trevor would think he'd won. He'd believe he could intimidate anyone who dared to stand up to him. That thought alone was enough to solidify her resolve. She wasn't just standing her ground for herself anymore. She was standing for everyone he'd tried to bully and silence. A minute later, Amina's suspicions were confirmed. She heard footsteps approaching, heavy, purposeful strides accompanied by murmured voices. She turned slowly, bracing herself as Trevor reappeared, flanked by two other men. They looked like him, older, white, and exuding the same smug arrogance that Trevor wore like a second skin. One was burly, with a thick neck and a shaved head, while the other was lankier, with a mean glint in his eyes. Both had the look of men who'd been in plenty of fights, the kind who enjoyed throwing their weight around and had likely never faced serious consequences for it. Trevor's face broke into a triumphant grin as he saw her waiting. He clearly thought her stillness was a sign of submission, a concession to the threat he now posed with his newfound allies. He swaggered forward, his injured wrist forgotten in his renewed confidence. "So, still here, huh?" he sneered, folding his arms and giving her a mocking once-over. "You must be dumber than I thought. But I guess that's typical for people like you, isn't it? You just don't know when to quit." Amina's jaw clenched, but she forced herself to remain calm. She'd faced down bullies before, but there was a venom in Trevor's words that cut deeper, an ugliness that went beyond simple spite. He wasn't just angry, he felt entitled to degrade her, to make her feel small. That entitlement, that twisted sense of superiority, was what she despised the most. She looked past him, sizing up the two men he'd brought with him. They were watching her with sneers of their own, as if she were some kind of curiosity, a spectacle they'd been called in to enjoy. Amina met each of their gazes in turn, making it clear that she wasn't afraid. If they wanted a fight, she wouldn't be the one backing down. "Still trying to prove something, Trevor?" she said evenly, folding her arms. "You couldn't handle me on your own, so you had to go and find your friends. Real brave of you." The sneer on Trevor's face faltered for just a moment, his pride clearly stung by her words. But he quickly recovered, his gaze hardening. "You think you're so tough, don't you?" he spat, glancing at his friends as if to share the joke. "Well, we'll see how tough you are when it's 3 against 1. Or are you going to try to preach to us about equality and respect?" He laughed, his tone dripping with mockery. The other two joined in, their laughter harsh and grating in the quiet street. Amina's heart pounded, but her face remained impassive. She knew she had to keep her composure, to not give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. They were feeding off her reactions, hoping to intimidate her into submission. But she wasn't about to let them win. She took a slow breath, grounding herself, her mind focused and clear. "You think you're men?" she asked quietly, her voice calm but laced with an edge that cut through their laughter. "You think ganging up on a woman makes you strong? It only proves how weak you really are." The laughter stopped, and the sneers hardened into scowls. The burly man with the shaved head stepped forward, cracking his knuckles with an exaggerated smirk. "Listen here, sweetheart," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "You might think you're something special, but around here you're nothing. You're just a mouthy little girl who doesn't know her place." Amina's eyes flashed with anger, but she kept her tone steady. "Funny," she replied. "I was just thinking the same thing about you." Her words were calm, almost conversational, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. She wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The lankier man shook his head, a sneer twisting his lips. "Trevor said you were a stubborn one," he muttered, glancing at his friend. "I didn't realize you were stupid too. Maybe we should teach you a lesson you won't forget." Trevor, sensing that the moment was right, took a step closer, his eyes glinting with anticipation. "Go ahead," he said, nodding toward his friends. Let's see if she's as tough as she thinks." The burly man reached for her, his hand moving fast and rough, intending to grab her arm and pull her off balance. But Amina was faster. With a fluid motion, she sidestepped, evading his grasp, and struck his forearm, forcing him to release his grip before he even had the chance to apply pressure. The man staggered back, momentarily thrown off by her skill and speed. Trevor's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He clearly hadn't expected her to fight back with such precision, and his friends looked equally surprised. They'd expected a frightened woman, someone who would beg or plead. Instead, they were facing someone who knew exactly how to defend herself. But Trevor wasn't willing to let it go that easily. "What are you waiting for?" he snapped at his friends, his voice laced with irritation. "Get her!" The lanky man lunged forward, aiming a clumsy punch at Amina's face. She sidestepped again, catching his arm and twisting it behind his back in one fluid motion. He yelped in pain as she applied just enough pressure to immobilize him, her grip firm but controlled. She wasn't trying to hurt him, just to show him that she wouldn't be intimidated. The burly man, now angrier than before, charged at her from the other side. Amina released the lanky man, spinning to face her new opponent with practiced precision. She blocked his advance with a quick kick to his knee, forcing him to stumble back. Her movements were smooth, each one calculated and precise, the result of years of training. She was in control, and she intended to stay that way. Trevor watched, his face twisting with rage and frustration, as his friends were repelled again and again. He could see the strength and discipline in Amina's movements, a strength that he had grossly underestimated. The sight of his friends being overpowered by the very woman he had tried to belittle filled him with a growing sense of dread. She was winning, not just physically but psychologically. She was breaking down their confidence, exposing their weaknesses. But he wasn't done yet. Trevor reached into his jacket, pulling out a small, concealed knife. His friends, regaining their composure, took a step back, realizing the escalation of the situation. Amina's gaze flicked to the knife, but her face remained impassive. She'd trained for situations like this, knew how to handle armed opponents. But she also knew that this was no longer just a matter of self-defense. It was a test of her will, of her ability to stand firm in the face of escalating danger. Trevor took a step forward, the knife glinting in the dim light. "I told you," he hissed, his voice dripping with malice. "You don't belong here, and now you're going to pay for disrespecting me." Amina didn't flinch. Her gaze was steady, her mind focused. She was ready, and as Trevor lunged toward her, she knew that this was her moment. To stand up not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been silenced, every person who had been told to stay down. With a calm breath, she moved forward, prepared to face whatever came next. The knife in Trevor's hand glinted in the fading light as he took another step toward Amina. His face was twisted with rage and desperation, an almost feral look in his eyes. He had lost control of the situation, and this knife, this last symbol of power, was his only remaining lifeline. His friends, seeing the weapon, took a cautious step back, not out of fear for him, but out of an almost animalistic respect for the escalation. They weren't sure how this would end, but they were eager to see it unfold. Amina, however, remained calm. Her heart pounded, yes, but her mind was clear, steady. She had trained for moments like this, times when danger felt tangible, like a weight pressing down on her. She knew how to move, how to defend herself against an armed opponent. But she also knew that this situation went beyond the physical. This wasn't just about a fight on the street. It was a battle of will, of defiance against the hatred and anger that men like Trevor carried around like a badge. As he approached, knife at the ready, Amina held her ground, her gaze steady and unwavering. She knew that her calmness would only enrage him further, but that was part of her strategy. She wanted him to know that his intimidation tactics had failed, that his knife didn't scare her. She wanted to show him that no matter how much he tried to dominate, she wouldn't cower. For a moment, Trevor hesitated, thrown off by her composure. He was used to people flinching, to seeing fear in their eyes. But Amina stood tall, her expression unreadable. She met his gaze with an intensity that seemed to slice through his bravado, exposing the weakness he was desperately trying to hide. It was as if she could see right through him, see the hollow fear and insecurity that lay beneath his aggression. The air between them was thick with tension, a silent battle waging within Trevor as he tried to reconcile his need for control with the reality that he was losing it. His hand tightened around the knife, his knuckles white. His friends watched, their smirks fading as they began to sense the shift in power. The woman they had thought would be an easy target was turning out to be far more formidable than they had anticipated. "Go ahead," Amina said, her voice low but filled with authority. "If you think that knife is going to give you the power you're so desperate for, then go ahead. But I promise you, it won't end the way you think." Her words cut through the silence like a blade of their own, striking at Trevor's pride and rattling his confidence. He blinked, momentarily caught off guard, but his anger quickly resurfaced. His face twisted into a sneer, and he took another step forward, the knife raised, his grip trembling slightly. He wanted to scare her, to see her fear, but instead, all he saw was calm defiance. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat, his voice laced with barely contained rage. "People like you think you can just walk around here like you own the place. But I'll show you. I'll show you what happens to people who don't know their place." Amina's gaze hardened, her patience wearing thin. She had dealt with men like him her entire life. Men who used their privilege, their physicality, their weapons as a shield for their own insecurities. She had no intention of backing down now. "I'm right where I belong," she replied, her voice steady. "Maybe it's you who doesn't belong here. People like you are nothing more than cowards, hiding behind your hate because you're too weak to confront what's really inside you." Trevor's face flushed with anger, his grip on the knife tightening. His friends shifted uncomfortably, glancing between him and Amina, unsure of how this would end. For the first time, they seemed to realize that this wasn't going the way they'd expected. They had come for a show of dominance, a quick display of power. Instead, they were witnessing the unraveling of their friend, his pride shattered piece by piece in the face of Amina's unbreakable will. Desperate to reassert his authority, Trevor lunged forward, the knife aimed directly at her. Amina's training kicked in, and she sidestepped gracefully, grabbing his wrist and twisting it with a practiced precision. The knife clattered to the ground as she forced his arm behind his back, immobilizing him with a firm grip. He struggled, his breath coming in short, furious gasps, but her hold was unyielding. "You think a knife makes you powerful?" she murmured, her voice calm but cutting. "Real power doesn't come from a weapon. It comes from strength, from character, from respect. Things you clearly know nothing about." Trevor thrashed in her grip, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. His friends looked on in stunned silence, no longer smirking or sneering. They were witnessing their friend's complete defeat, not just physically, but mentally. Amina had stripped away the facade he wore, exposing the small, scared man underneath. But even as she held him, Amina knew that this confrontation was reaching a critical point. She could humiliate him here, make him feel the consequences of his actions. But she also understood that violence begets violence, and that pushing him too far could lead to unintended consequences. She needed to end this in a way that left no doubt about who held the true power, but without stooping to his level. Slowly, she released his arm, letting him stumble forward. He caught himself barely, his face flushed and his eyes blazing with a mixture of rage and shame. He turned to face her, breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides. But she saw the hesitation in his eyes, the realization that he was outmatched, not just in strength, but in resolve. "You got lucky," he snarled, his voice low and shaky. "This isn't over. You hear me? I'll make sure you regret this." Amina took a step back, her posture relaxed but her gaze unwavering. "You think you scare me," she replied calmly. "I'm not afraid of you, Trevor. I'm not afraid of people like you. You can threaten me all you want, but I'm still standing here. You're the one who's walking away." Her words seemed to pierce through his remaining defenses, leaving him speechless. He looked at her, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for something, anything, to regain his dignity. But there was nothing left to say. He had lost, and they both knew it. Trevor's friends, sensing the futility of the situation, muttered something under their breath and took a step back, clearly unwilling to face the humiliation he had endured. For a brief moment, they looked at Amina, and she saw something in their eyes. Respect, perhaps, or at least an acknowledgement that she was not someone to be trifled with. As Trevor backed away, his face a mask of fury, Amina felt a surge of relief mixed with pride. She had stood her ground, defended herself without resorting to the same hatred and violence he had brought to the encounter. She had proven that strength wasn't about brute force, but about resilience, about the courage to face down hatred and emerge unbroken. But even as she watched him retreat, she knew that this was only the beginning. Men like Trevor didn't simply let things go. His threats were not idle, and she knew he would try to retaliate in some way, to reclaim the control he had lost. And while she wasn't afraid, she understood that she needed to be vigilant. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the message she had sent to him, and to anyone else who thought they could use their power to silence others. As he disappeared around the corner, Amina took a deep breath, allowing herself a moment of quiet reflection. She had faced down her fears, had stood up not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, to feel less than. And in that moment, she felt a sense of peace, a calm certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. But she also felt a lingering sense of caution. She knew that Trevor's defeat wouldn't sit well with him, that his pride would demand some kind of retribution. And as she walked away, she prepared herself for whatever came next, knowing that she was ready, that she would meet any challenge with the same unwavering resolve. Because this was her city, her community, her life, and no one, least of all a man like Trevor, was going to take that from her. Amina knew that Trevor's retreat was only temporary. Men like him didn't let go of grudges easily, especially not when their pride had been so thoroughly shattered in public. Even as she watched him disappear down the street, her instincts told her that this wasn't over. She could feel the tension lingering in the air, a sense of foreboding that hinted at a coming storm. She took a steadying breath, reminding herself that she had faced worse challenges. Her years of training had taught her to anticipate danger, to remain calm and focused in the face of threats. But she also understood that this situation was different. This wasn't just about defending herself physically. It was a confrontation with a man who embodied a mentality she had fought against her entire life, a mentality that sought to devalue her, to make her feel small. And while she had held her ground today, she knew that Trevor's ego wouldn't allow him to simply walk away. Amina decided to head back to the community center. It was a place where she felt grounded, a symbol of the resilience and unity she had worked so hard to build. She thought of the young women she had trained earlier, the ones who looked up to her as a mentor and a role model. They were the reason she fought, the reason she stood up against people like Trevor. They deserved to live in a world where they could walk freely, without fear of harassment or violence. And today, she had shown them that strength came not just from physical power, but from refusing to be intimidated. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, scanning the street behind her, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The sidewalks were mostly empty, save for a few distant figures, none of whom seemed to be paying her any particular attention. Yet, the unease remained, gnawing at the edges of her mind. Just as she was about to turn the corner, she heard the sound of an engine revving. A black SUV sped around the corner, tires screeching as it came to an abrupt stop just a few feet ahead of her. The doors swung open, and two men jumped out, both of them tall and broad-shouldered, with hard expressions that told her they meant business. She recognized one of them immediately, Trevor's friend, the burly man with the shaved head. The other man was unfamiliar, but he had the same look in his eyes, a look that radiated hostility. Trevor stepped out of the SUV last, his face twisted in a satisfied sneer. The bruise on his wrist was still visible, a dark reminder of their earlier encounter, and the sight of it seemed to fuel his anger. He looked at her with a kind of smug triumph, as if he had finally regained the upper hand. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "Did you really think it was over? Did you think you could just humiliate me and walk away without consequences?" Amina's heart quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. She stood her ground, refusing to let him see any hint of fear. "What do you think you're going to accomplish with this, Trevor?" she asked calmly. "All you're doing is proving how weak you really are." His face reddened, and his friends exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the rising tension. But Trevor wasn't deterred. He took a step closer, his gaze darkening. "Weak? You think I'm weak?" he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "I'll show you who's weak. I'll show you what happens when people like you get out of line." Amina knew that reasoning with him was pointless. He was beyond logic, consumed by a toxic need to reassert his dominance. She shifted her weight slightly, preparing herself for whatever might come next. Her stance was calm but ready, her mind focused and alert. If they wanted to threaten her, they would soon learn that she was not an easy target. The second man, the one she didn't recognize, spoke up, his voice a low growl. "You caused a lot of trouble for our friend here. People around here don't like that kind of thing. Maybe you should have thought twice before you started acting like you owned the place." Amina raised an eyebrow, her gaze steady. "People like me? Or people like you, who think they can just bully their way through life? Is that how you get respect? By threatening people who aren't afraid of you?" The man's eyes narrowed, and he took a step toward her, but Trevor held up a hand, stopping him. "No," he said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "We're going to do this my way." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a phone, holding it up for her to see. For a moment, Amina was confused, But then he began speaking, his voice low and menacing. "You see, I have connections," he said. "Friends who would be very interested in hearing about someone like you. I can make a few calls, and suddenly, every cop in this city will be watching you, waiting for you to slip up. And trust me, they'll find something. People like you always have something to hide." Amina felt a surge of anger, but she kept her face impassive. She knew exactly what he was trying to do. This was his way of trying to intimidate her, to make her feel as though she was under constant surveillance, like she had no right to exist without his permission. But she refused to give him that power. "You think that scares me?" she replied, her voice steady. "Go ahead, make your calls. I have nothing to hide, and if you think that's going to stop me from standing up to you, you're even more delusional than I thought." Trevor's face contorted with fury. Her defiance was like a slap in the face, a reminder that his threats held no weight with her. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them until they were mere inches apart. She could feel the heat of his anger, the barely controlled violence simmering beneath the surface. "You really don't get it, do you?" he hissed. "You think you're untouchable, but you're just another nobody. You're nothing, and I'm going to make sure you remember that." Amina's eyes flashed with determination. She was done with his threats, done with his toxic arrogance. "You don't scare me, Trevor," she said quietly. "You never did. I'm not just standing up for myself. I'm standing up for everyone you've ever tried to intimidate. People like you think you can just bully your way through life, but one day you're going to realize that there are consequences. Maybe today is that day." Her words hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment she saw something flicker in his eyes. Fear, perhaps, or the dawning realization that his usual tactics were failing. But he quickly masked it with anger, his face twisting into a sneer. "Big talk," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But words don't mean anything out here. It's actions that matter." With a nod to his friends, he signaled them to advance. The burly man with the shaved head cracked his knuckles, his expression dark with anticipation. The other man grinned, his eyes cold and calculating. Amina braced herself, her body instinctively shifting into a defensive stance. She could feel her muscles tense, ready to react at a moment's notice. As the men closed in, Amina focused on her breathing, keeping her mind sharp and her movements precise. She knew she couldn't afford any mistakes. They were bigger than her, outnumbering her 3-1, but she had the advantage of discipline and training. She'd spent years mastering her technique, honing her reflexes, and she wasn't about to let that go to waste. The first man lunged at her, his hand reaching out to grab her arm. Amina sidestepped, using his own momentum to throw him off balance. He stumbled forward, momentarily caught off guard, and she seized the opportunity to deliver a swift, calculated strike to his side. He grunted in pain, staggering back, but his expression quickly turned to rage as he regrouped. The second man moved in, circling her with a predatory gleam in his eyes. He feinted to the left, trying to catch her off guard, but Amina saw through his ploy. She blocked his advance with a swift kick, forcing him to retreat. Her movements were fluid and controlled, each one calculated to keep her opponents at bay without expending unnecessary energy. Trevor watched from the sidelines, his face twisted with frustration as he saw his friends struggle against her. He had expected this to be quick, an easy victory to restore his bruised ego. Instead, he was witnessing the unraveling of his plan, the growing realization that Amina was more than capable of defending herself. "You think you're so clever," he snarled, his voice laced with bitterness. "But you're just delaying the inevitable. You can't keep this up forever." Amina glanced at him, her expression calm but resolute. "Maybe not," she replied. "But I can keep going long enough to make sure you remember this." Her words only fueled his rage, and he clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. But he remained on the sidelines, unwilling to risk another direct confrontation with her. Instead, he urged his friends to press on, his desperation evident in the way he shouted at them to keep fighting. But as the skirmish continued, it became clear that his friends were no match for Amina's skill and discipline. One by one they faltered, their strength no match for her precision. The burly man with the shaved head stumbled back, clutching his side, while the other man's breathing grew labored as he struggled to keep up with her relentless pace. Finally, Trevor, realizing that his plan was falling apart, barked a sharp order, signaling his friends to retreat. They exchanged uneasy glances but obeyed, backing away with muttered curses and resentful glances in her direction. Trevor, his face twisted with hatred, lingered for a moment, as if weighing whether to make one last attempt at intimidation. But Amina held his gaze, her expression unyielding, and he seemed to sense that any further confrontation would only end in further humiliation. With a final sneer, he turned and climbed back into the SUV, slamming the door behind him. The engine roared to life, and moments later, the vehicle sped off, leaving Amina standing alone in the quiet street. As the dust settled, Amina took a deep breath, feeling the tension slowly begin to dissipate. She had faced them down, stood her ground, and refused to be cowed. But she knew this wasn't the end. Trevor's hatred ran deep, and men like him didn't simply disappear. He would be back, she was certain of it. But she also knew that she would be ready, because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about sending a message to Trevor, to his friends, and to everyone else who thought they could wield their power without consequence. The quiet street felt different now, as though it had absorbed the tension and conflict that had just taken place. Amina stood still for a moment, catching her breath, her gaze fixed on the spot where the SUV had vanished around the corner. The silence that followed was heavy, yet oddly calming. She had faced down Trevor and his thugs, enduring their threats, their violence, and their attempts to belittle her. But she had emerged unbroken, standing tall and resolute. A few onlookers, having witnessed the scuffle from afar, slowly approached. They had kept their distance, wary of intervening, but their expressions now showed a mix of admiration and awe. An older woman with silver-streaked hair stepped forward, her eyes wide with concern but filled with respect. "You were incredible," the woman said softly. "I've never seen anyone stand up to them like that." Amina offered her a small, tired smile. "Someone has to," she replied, her voice steady despite the exhaustion settling into her muscles. "If we let people like him push us around, it never stops." The woman nodded, understanding, and murmured her thanks before retreating. Other bystanders cast Amina nods of approval and murmurs of solidarity, offering her quiet affirmations of support. In that moment, she realized that her actions had resonated, had touched the people around her. She hadn't just defended herself, she had made a statement. But Amina knew that Trevor's bruised ego wouldn't let him leave things here. She had humiliated him twice now, and men like Trevor didn't forget. Her intuition told her that he would come back, possibly with more dangerous intentions. She would need to be prepared for whatever came next. With that in mind, she walked purposefully toward the police station, knowing that she needed to make the first move. She wanted to report the incident, to ensure that Trevor's aggression was documented. Even if it didn't lead to immediate consequences, she wanted an official record of his behavior, a paper trail that could protect her if things escalated further. Inside the station, Amina was met with a polite but skeptical officer behind the counter. She explained the situation, describing Trevor, his threats, and the intimidation tactics he had used. The officer listened, taking notes, but Amina could sense a hint of doubt in his expression, as though he was struggling to believe that a woman could stand up to 3 men in the way she described. "Are you sure there's nothing you want to add?" he asked, his tone laced with a subtle condescension. "It sounds like a remarkable story." Amina met his gaze unflinching. "Everything I told you is true," she said firmly. "If you need witnesses, there were people on the street who saw it. I suggest you follow up with them." The officer hesitated, sensing the intensity in her voice. Finally, he nodded and assured her that he would file the report. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and Amina knew she had to take whatever steps she could to protect herself. She left the station with a sense of resolve, feeling the weight of what lay ahead but refusing to be intimidated. Over the next few days, Amina stayed vigilant. She noticed familiar cars passing by her apartment, caught glimpses of figures watching her from across the street. She knew Trevor was trying to intimidate her, to make her feel unsafe. But each time she spotted one of his men lurking nearby, she met their gaze with steady defiance, letting them know that she was unafraid. Then, late one evening, as she was closing up the community center after another self-defense session, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She hesitated before answering, instinctively bracing herself. The voice on the other end was low and menacing, unmistakably Trevor's. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he sneered, running to the cops like a scared little girl. "Do you really think they'll protect you?" Amina's grip tightened around the phone, but she kept her voice calm. "I think you're the one who's scared, Trevor," she replied evenly. "Otherwise, why are you hiding behind threats and phone calls? If you're so powerful, why don't you come out and face me yourself?" There was a pause, a moment where she could almost feel his frustration through the phone. "You're going to regret this," he spat. "I'll make sure of it." But Amina didn't flinch. "Do what you want, Trevor. I'm done being afraid of you." She hung up, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a response. She knew he was desperate, his control slipping, his arrogance turning to desperation. And in that moment, she realized something. She had already won. Trevor's power had been built on fear, on the belief that he could intimidate others into submission. But she had broken that power, shattered his illusion of control. No matter what he did next, he would never get that back. The next morning, Amina woke to find messages from members of the community center, as well as other residents in the neighborhood. News of her confrontation with Trevor had spread, and people were rallying around her. They offered their support, their solidarity, promising to stand by her if things escalated. Some even mentioned that they had reported suspicious behavior to the police, keeping an eye on Trevor's men who lurked in the neighborhood. Amina felt a surge of gratitude, her heart warmed by the outpouring of support. She hadn't realized how much her stand had impacted others, how her courage had inspired them to stand up as well. She wasn't alone in this fight. She was part of a community that valued justice, that refused to be cowed by bullies like Trevor. As the days went by, Trevor's presence faded, his men disappearing from the streets, their intimidation tactics waning. Amina suspected that he had finally understood that his methods were futile, that every attempt to regain control only strengthened her resolve and rallied more people to her side. One evening, as she walked home from the community center, she noticed the familiar figure of the older woman who had witnessed her initial encounter with Trevor. The woman approached her with a warm smile, her eyes filled with respect. "You know, people around here, they're talking about what you did," the woman said softly. "You gave us all a little more courage. People like him. They think they can scare us, but you showed us that we don't have to be afraid." Amina smiled, feeling a sense of pride and accomplishment. "Thank you," she replied, her voice filled with gratitude. "But I couldn't have done it without all of you. We're stronger together." The woman nodded, a look of understanding passing between them. They shared a quiet moment, a moment of mutual respect, before parting ways. As Amina continued on her way, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. She had faced down fear, defied intimidation, and emerged stronger. Trevor's threats might linger in the background, but she knew that she had built something more powerful, a community bound by courage and resilience. And in that moment, she realized that the true victory wasn't in defeating Trevor, but in inspiring others to stand up, to reclaim their own power. She walked forward, her head held high, knowing that she had not only changed her own life, but had also sparked a change that would ripple through her community for years to come. Because true strength wasn't about winning a fight. It was about standing up, even when the odds were against you, and empowering others to do the same. In the weeks that followed, Amina felt the change rippling through the neighborhood. People who once kept their heads down, avoiding trouble, were now standing a little taller, greeting each other with nods of mutual respect and a shared understanding. Trevor and his cronies had vanished, their intimidation tactics exposed and stripped of power, leaving behind only the faint memory of their attempts to control and divide. Amina had faced them down, but the strength she had ignited went far beyond a single confrontation. It was a quiet revolution, a shift in the air, a newfound sense of unity that bound people together. One afternoon, Amina was at the community center, packing up after a self-defense workshop. The session had been different from her usual classes. The room had been filled not only with young women, but with older members of the community, men and women who wanted to learn, who wanted to feel that same strength she had shown. They practiced diligently, many of them sharing their own stories of facing discrimination or intimidation, stories they had kept buried, but now felt safe enough to share. Amina listened, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. She had started these classes to teach self-defense, but they had become so much more, a place where people could come together, share their struggles, and build each other up. As she closed the door, her thoughts drifted to the journey that had led her here, to this moment. What had started as an act of self-defense had become a movement, a call for change that she knew would last. As she stepped outside, she saw a familiar face waiting by the entrance. The older woman who had first approached her after the confrontation with Trevor. Her name was Mrs. Jameson, a retired teacher who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. Amina had come to know her well in recent weeks, often seeing her at the center, helping with classes and encouraging others. Mrs. Jameson smiled warmly, her eyes reflecting a wisdom and resilience that Amina had come to admire. "You've done something remarkable here, Amina," she said, her voice filled with quiet pride. "You've given us all a reason to feel strong, to stand together." Amina returned the smile, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. I couldn't have done it alone. You all gave me the courage to keep going, to stand up when it mattered. Mrs. Jameson nodded, placing a gentle hand on Amina's shoulder. That's what community is for, isn't it? We lift each other up. But you were the spark, dear. Without you, we might still be letting people like Trevor walk all over us. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as the afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the neighborhood. Amina knew that what she had built here was just the beginning. There would always be challenges, people who sought to undermine and intimidate. But now, they had a foundation, a sense of strength and solidarity that no one could take away. Later that evening, as Amina walked home, she reflected on how much had changed, not just in her community but within herself. Facing Trevor had forced her to confront fears and insecurities she hadn't realized she was still carrying. She had spent years training her body and mind, building herself into a fighter. But this experience had shown her a new kind of strength, a strength that came not from fighting alone, but from standing with others. As she rounded the corner to her apartment, she noticed a small group of neighbors gathered nearby. They greeted her with warm smiles and nods of recognition, gestures that spoke of a shared respect. Among them was a young girl, no older than 10, who looked up at Amina with wide, admiring eyes. "Are you the lady who stood up to the bad guys?" the girl asked, her voice a mix of wonder and awe. Amina chuckled, bending down to meet the girl's gaze. "I guess you could say that, but it wasn't just me. I had a lot of help from people who believe in doing what's right." The girl nodded solemnly, absorbing Amina's words as if they were a secret lesson. "I want to be brave like you someday," she said, her small voice filled with determination. Amina felt a surge of warmth and hope. "You already are brave," she replied, gently squeezing the girl's hand. "Never forget that, and always remember, true strength comes from standing up for others, not just yourself." The girl smiled, and Amina could see the spark of courage in her eyes, the beginning of a journey that might one day bring her back to the community center, ready to stand for what was right. It was a reminder that her actions, her courage, had planted seeds that would grow long after she was gone. As she finally headed home, Amina felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The confrontation with Trevor had been challenging, even frightening, but it had also been transformative. She had found a part of herself she hadn't known was there, a leader, a mentor, a pillar of strength for her community. And in that journey, she had discovered a truth that would stay with her forever. Strength wasn't about standing alone. It was about standing together, lifting others, and creating a legacy that would empower future generations. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but Amina knew she was ready. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the same courage and resolve that had brought her to this moment. And as she stepped through her front door, she knew, with a quiet certainty, that she would never walk alone again.